Hello, I'm Michael Liebreich and this is Cleaning Up. Welcome to the first episode in Season 12. And as always, we have a great lineup of guests. Before we get started, if you're enjoying Cleaning Up, please make sure that you like episodes, subscribe on YouTube or your favourite podcast platform, and leave a review. That really helps other people to find us. Please recommend Cleaning Up to your friends and colleagues, and sign up for our free newsletter at cleaninguppod.substack.com. That's cleaninguppod.substack.com. Cleaning Up is brought to you by the Liebreich Foundation, the Gilardini Foundation, and Ecopragma Capital. Now, if you want to get a sense of the past and future trajectory of climate action, you simply have to understand China, and you have to understand finance. There is no one better placed to share insights on both than my guest today, Dr. Ma Jun, founder and president of the Institute of Finance and Sustainability in Beijing. Between 2014 and 2020, Dr. Ma served as Chief Economist and then member of the Monetary Policy Committee of the People's Bank of China. Like a number of other guests on Cleaning Up, Dr. Ma was convinced of the need for decisive action on climate and environment by China's apocalyptically bad air quality in 2014. And as a banker, he knew that the financial sector had to play its part. Over the subsequent years, Dr. Ma played a key role in the development of sustainable finance in China and around the world. He led the drafting of China's green finance and green bond guidelines. He led work on green finance at the G20. He pushed for the greening of China's Belt and Road Initiative. He set up initiatives with the global accounting and standards bodies. And he helped enlist the world's major financial centers in the drive to green the capital markets. Dr. Ma is a towering figure in the area of green finance in China and in the world. Please welcome him to Cleaning Up. So, Dr. Ma, thank you so much for joining us here on Cleaning Up.
Thank you very much, Michael, for the invitation.
It's a pleasure to see you. It's been some years since we met in person. It was, I think, definitely before COVID, on one of your trips to London.
Yeah, I've been to London many, many times. I think more than 40 times. But we had a break, during the COVID, and now I'm coming back.
Well, maybe we won't fly as much, but certainly it would be great to do this sort of thing in person. But could you start, as we always do, by hearing in your words the very short version, because you've done so much, but of your bio? What is it that you do?
Well, currently I'm working on green finance, sustainable finance, as you know, but I used to be a macroeconomist for more than 20 years before I really turned myself into a environmentalist. That was about 10 years ago. So really between 1990s and in the following 10 years, I was an economist in the World Bank, the IMF, and Deutsche Bank. Then in 2013, that was the time of my turning point. I was still the chief economist for Deutsche Bank in the Greater China region. And I was hosting a conference in China. That was, I think, the beginning of 2013, and exactly it was January 13 of 2013. I remember that vividly. At that conference, I was talking to about 500 people. These are international investors about Chinese economy and so on. And suddenly, everybody was coughing, and for a moment, I couldn't hear myself. And really, only on that day, I figured out that that was a PM 2.5. You know PM 2.5, right? That's the air pollution indicator.
That's right. So the PM 2.5 is the very small particles of, London. Of course, we had the London smogs historically. Those were PM 10s. Those are big particles you could really not even see through. But in China at the time, the problem was the 2.5s, the smaller particles, and they reached some enormous peak, like 940 people. I mean, I'm not sure how
You were right. Actually, on that day, it was 1,000 in Beijing. and the safe level according to WHO is 25. So
Right.
the entire city was like the airport smoking room in terms of density of air pollutants. And so really from that time, I began to rethink the implication of everything we were doing in the financial sector, especially investment banking. And we know that at that time we loved financing the polluting activities. For example, coal-fired power generation, steel, cement, petrochemical, paper, and all of these companies. They made a lot of money, and not just companies, but also the financiers and us brokers. And the brokers were making money because we arranged the financing for the polluting companies. And the result of that, of course, after the economics, it was the social consequences. And I figured out from the WHO report that 12 million people die prematurely every year because of pollution, including air pollution, water pollution, land contamination. And I was totally shocked by these figures. So it really forced me to think about what's wrong in the financial system. Why the financial system was allocating so much money to polluting activities, which resulted in so much death. And in that year, 2013, I wrote a book, which is later published in English as well. The English name of that is Economics of Air Pollution in China. The Chinese name is the Fighting Air Pollution, the Big Bang Policy to Fight Air Pollution. And in that book, I proposed the idea of developing green finance in China, really changing the incentive structures so that more money would be allocated to cleaner, greener, less polluting activities. So that was the beginning of my journey towards green finance.
And what we could, what we'll do, if I might, we're going to put into the show notes. We will put in a link to the English version of that book, and also to two other episodes, because this resonates with two of our previous guests on Cleaning Up, which was Jonathan Maxwell, who was with HSBC at the time, and that same 2.5 episode was his epiphany as well, to start something called Sustainable Development Capital, which is now a leading investor in energy efficiency and other solutions based in the UK, but operating globally. And we also had Lauri Milevirta a month or so ago, who talked about how he's been, taking the data on air pollution and other issues and making it available to create the kind of understanding and the background pressure to enable these sort of societal changes. So those are two things for our listeners that I think will be relevant.
So really, PM2.5 catalyzed a lot of thinking and solutions to the really sustainability issues. Yeah.
Yes.
So really, after that, I was lucky to have the opportunity to join the PBOC, the Chinese Central Bank, in 2014. That was 10 years ago. So starting from that year, I set up the Green Finance Working Group within the central bank, and we made the 14 recommendations to the central government. And very quickly, the central government adopted these recommendations. I think it was because of the need for financing the cleanup of the air pollution. And at that time, we estimated that China needed something like 4 trillion RMB per year for environmental protection, including dealing with air pollution, water pollution, land contamination. But the government can only came up with 10% of the money. And the rest, the 90% of the financing has to come from the financial sector. So that was exactly the time, I wrote the proposal on green finance and the government wanted the money, so it was a perfect match. And it became the green finance guidelines later in 2015 and 2016 in China.
So I got a couple of questions. One is, did you frame it in that work as a big problem that requires us to sink lots of money? Or did you frame it as, actually, this is the next big opportunity? First question. The second question is, was that why People's Bank of China, why you got the job? Was it your work on finance, or was that kind of, they didn't really know you were about to go off in that direction? And so, this is fascinating to me.
Yeah, I was a macroeconomist. I said to you, the 10 years before I joined the PBOC, I spent a lot of time on, monetary policy, the exchange rate policy, financial stability, and all of these pure finance related, macro issues. That's why they recruited me. And but I became a green economist already 2013. 1 year before I started as a green finance policy research in the central bank. So it was an accident in a sense. I was recruited as a macroeconomist, but I actually did the green finance work within the central bank because I think nobody was doing that. It was a vacuum. It's a clean space for me to start something, and because it was a huge demand for green finance within the system.
And did you frame it as an opportunity?
Now, we were not talking too much on sort of opportunity for the private sector at that time. And it was really a demand from the government. The government knew that it needed money to fix air pollution and other pollution. And that's why the policy proposal, which was for the government, because we need to formulate the policies and incentives from all different ministries. We need to convince the government rather than convincing the private sector guys. That's why the entire proposal was around how to mobilize money in the entire country to deal with air pollution as quickly as possible. But of course, it created a lot of opportunities for the private sector. In fact, after the policy guidelines were out, I think now it's about 8 years, China has already developed the largest green lending market, 30 trillion RMB outstanding, and the largest green bond market, 2.5 trillion RMB outstanding. All of these involved a lot of opportunities. For example, these instruments supported the largest renewable industry in the world, the largest EV industry in the world, and largest battery industry in the world. So these are real opportunities within the real economy. But of course, policymakers didn't think that much, 10 years later, how much, GDP we could create, revenue we can create, how much job we can create, but we did that.
It's a fascinating debate about what leads. Is it the real economy that then demands capital, or can you kind of create the real economy by allocating capital? Where do you sit? Because it's a very live debate with a lot of central banks now.
No, it's not the lack of money. It was the wrong allocation of money that was the problem. We had a lot of money. As I said, we allocated to the dirty activities, right? And the incentives were wrong because we allowed them to make too much money. And that's why it channeled all the resources in bringing, people, technology, land, all into the polluting activities. And what we did really in the past 10 years in the green financial system is to change the incentive so that less capital going to the polluting activities and more going to the green and sustainable.
But let me just clarify. When you say we change the incentives, there's two places you can do that. You can do that within the Ministry of Transport or the transport sector, the energy sector, the building materials sector, the real estate sector, or you can do it within the finance sector by doing things that remove barriers or change the costs of capital. So, there's a spectrum. Of course, you need to do a bit of both, but where are you on that spectrum? What do you think works?
Yeah, I think the beauty of our system is that we're able to arrange an integrated approach and under the heading of sustainable finance or green finance framework. Because at that time, we did this guideline as a consolidated effort of 7 different ministries. It's not just from central bank. In 2015-16, I was leading the drafting of this document. It involved the central bank, the banking regulator, the securities regulator, the Ministry of Finance, the NDRC, which is doing planning of the real economy, and the environmental ministry. So we have so many ministries with their policy tools, some in the real economy for building, transportation, energy, and so on. Some has the power on carbon, markets and so on, and some with incentives in the banking system, and some can incentivize the stocks, and bonds resources. So we actually came up with 35 policy actions within the document. And we design a range of, you can either call them incentives or disincentives, because some of these are incentives, like the central bank came up with cheaper financing for green activities. And we also had the disclosure requirements. You have to disclose your environmental impact. If you're doing the green things, you reduce carbon, you reduce air pollution, water pollution, then you'll be viewed as a good guy, by the regulator, by the market. If the disclosure shows that you are doing the wrong thing, then you are penalized, at many levels, at government level, by public opinions and by consumers and so on.
So just to close on the question as I've framed it, real economy versus finance, although the NDRC was only one, and the Environment Ministry, that was only 2 of the 7. But the NDRC, of course, then works with all the other ministries on the real economy and is extremely powerful. I think that's fair to say for our audience, just to clarify.
Exactly. You know the Chinese system quite well. NDRC is what we call the mini state council. It coordinates all the line ministries, in charge of, for example, building, transportation, manufacturing, and so on and so forth.
Now, I want to dive in on one thing that you said, which was about, you've got a lot of stuff around disclosure, and that feels very comfortable and very, and I know that you've done extraordinary work, and so have, that's been going on in parallel. We'll come on to some of the work you've done globally and internationally. But you did say that the central bank gives a lower cost of capital to the people doing that sort of, to doing the right thing versus the polluting thing. And that's a big debate with some people, particularly, in Europe, it would be the Germans would say level playing field, and the central bank should not tilt the cost of capital towards anything, because then they're essentially second guessing policy. But I take it from those proposals that you made, would not subscribe to that.
Well, different central banks have different mandates. I was deeply involved in this NGFS, which is the central bank's network of greening the financial system, and I was sitting on the steering committee for 4 years. So we have a lot of debate on what central banks should do and can do in terms of pushing for greening of the real economy. And in China, it was clear from the very beginning, the Chinese central bank has a mandate to facilitate and support structural transformation, including green transformation. So we had a requirement, a mandate, obligation to stimulate reallocation of resources, especially capital, towards green activities. So very naturally, as early as 2017, right after the guideline was out, we started this green relending facility, which is offering low-cost funding facility to selected green activities in some jurisdictions as a pilot. And then later it became the decarbonization facility, which offers low funding facility to a larger number of green activities, such as renewable energy, industrial decarbonization, and CCUS, and so on. But in Europe and many other places, the central banks do not have that mandate. In some central banks, they say, my mandate is only targeting inflation to 2%. That's it, right? So I have nothing to do with stimulating resource allocation for a particular sector, and some may view them as distortion to the economy because the market signal is supposed to work. But our argument is that climate change is the area of most visible externality, which means that the market doesn't really work in this particular space. And you need to correct this market failure by government policy instruments, including the central bank instruments. So that's our sort of theory behind the pushing for structural transformation within the Chinese central bank.
That's fascinating. I would love to see a debate between you and Milton Friedman or Hayek or somebody on that. But that's not going to happen for obvious reasons. But let me just come to that's all great. But then, of course, what's also happening, and it's still happening in parallel, is there's still a lot of money flowing in China to coal-fired power stations and to polluting industries. And there's one of the concerns, and it's a concern that I raised. I was on an advisory board at the OECD, and in 2018, I said, "Look, we're now building this huge green industry globally. It's fantastic, but it's no good if it's not actually shutting down and replacing. If it's just coming on top of the old emitting, polluting industries, we're not going to solve climate change." And is that a concern of yours when you see what's actually still being funded in China?
Well, it's a very complex issue. On the one hand, China still heavily rely on coal as a main source of energy, and on the margin, the increase of power capacity, definitely the renewable is the biggest, is a majority of the increase. But the base of coal and coal-fired power generation is so big, right? A small percentage increase will represent a fairly big absolute amount of increase. And the main issue that's been debated the last few years, I think not only in China, but many other countries, that the energy security, for various reasons, maybe geopolitics, maybe, local, factors. Periodically, we face a power shortage. And a quicker way of fixing power shortage is turn up the coal-fired power generation because they are ready, they're there, or to increase power production, coal-fired power generation, as well as coal mining. So there's a short-term conflict between energy safety, energy security, vis-a-vis sustainability or the climate objective. And of course, within the finance sector, we're also seeing that debate. Shall we actually invest or lend to coal-fired power generation at this moment? I think the majority of the banks, including in China, are actually saying I'm reluctant to do that because I need to look beyond the next 1 or 2 years where we need to fix the power shortage. I need to know whether in 5 years, 10 years, 20 years time, these power facilities will still be used or they will become, stressed, distressed assets. So that concern is leading to reluctance of many banks, in fact, in China, to fund the coal-fired power generation project, even though they are being, approved.
And is this on the radar screen as a macroeconomic risk? Because, and I'm thinking more broadly than just coal-fired power stations. I mean, we've seen how coal power production has gone off a cliff in the UK over a decade. It went from 40% to nearly zero. And we see the same sort of thing happening in Europe and in the US, not really driven by policy, but ultimately driven by the sort of fundamental economics just kind of flips. But it's not just coal. I mean, you've got, huge amounts of real estate and a stressed real estate sector that has not been building clean real estate, low carbon real estate. And so are those, is that another, I guess I'm grappling with, are there these kind of stranded asset risks because of the transition? And is there a discussion about that in China?
Well, I think now in many sectors, they're facing dilemmas. For example, in the real estate sector, I had a lot of conversation with real estate property owners on the need for them to, renovate and retrofit their projects with new technology, decarbonization, in their real estate projects and so on. Then the first question is, am I going to make money on this? Can I get my money back within 7 years? If it's too expensive, let me use old technology for now. And the other thing that's often being mentioned by property owners, who are reluctant to take, new technologies, that the new technologies are not, safe, not secure in terms of delivering their promised, green indicators and credentials and whatever, right? So I need to make sure that all the equipment you install will be working, and with very, very low probability of breaking down. So all these are reasons why ideally we should move more quickly towards low carbon technology in particular areas such as real estate, transportation. But then in reality, they are moving at a slower pace than we hope.
But isn't there a huge sort of lifetime redundancy issue in the next few decades. So I was on the board of Transport for London, and there was a particular bridge, you may know it, the Hammersmith flyover. When you come in from Heathrow, you go over it. And they suddenly discovered, just when I was around 2012, when we had our Olympics, they discovered that it was ready to fall over because it was built in the 1960s, I think it was. And it then reached the point where it was redundant. Nobody thought about how it would be replaced. Building it cost a few tens of millions of pounds in today's money. Repairing it cost, I think it was 120 million pounds. And, isn't there an issue with China has all of the real estate, the transportation, the infrastructure of this incredible, astonishing boom of the, let's say, I don't know, 1990 to 2020, that you're now going to have to replace it, and it has to be replaced clean. Is that debate going on about how we actually move the finance system fast enough actually to deal with that challenge?
Yeah, that's a debate I think can be moved by what we call climate risk analysis by the financial institutions. And these financial institutions can actually impose this risk analysis on the project owners. You have to tell me, if you use the old technology, carbon-intensive technology, are your property still going to maintain your value, in 20 years' time? Is the loan, I extended to you, going to be defaulted on because of valuation decline and your decline profitability? So these are the risk analysis. I think is becoming more popular, but it's not a mandatory requirement yet. It will be. In fact, you probably heard about ISSB, right? International Sustainability Standards Board, which is now aggressively pushing for the adoption by different jurisdictions. And within that ISSB requirement, in S2, the climate-related information requirement, there is one piece that's called climate risk analysis. And essentially ask the company to tell the market, tell the financiers that, in 10, 20 years' time, whether my project is going to survive all these, climate-related shocks, including shift in consumer sentiment and decline in your demand and increase in your operating cost.
So I promised that we would talk about your international activities, which is where we first met, and they've been prolific. And I think probably the starting point is the G20. So China's presidency in 2016, I believe, where you set up a working group on green finance. Can you, so you took some of that work that you had done over the 3 years, I guess, previously in China, and then used that platform to take it global. Is that a fair? Is that how you saw it?
Sure. The idea started in 2015 when we were planning for the China presidency of G20 in 2016. As you know, as a presidency, you can set an agenda on what to be discussed and on which topic we want to form global consensus. So we decided to do this on green finance because we believe that it's not only useful in China, but should also be helpful for many, many other countries in embarking on their green and sustainable journey. So in 2015, I think that was the early part of 2015, March, I actually went to London and I saw Andrew Bailey. He was a deputy governor of the central bank at that time. And I told Andrew that China is thinking about launching a G20 Green Finance Study Group, which we hope will be co-chaired by China and the UK, namely the PBOC and the Bank of England, to promote a global consensus on green sustainable finance. And Andrew, I think he thought about that for 5 seconds, and then he said, "That's a good idea. Let's do it." And in the afternoon, he said to me, "Mark Carney has agreed to this idea." So that was the beginning of the G20 Green Finance Study Group. So I had the luck to co-chair this group for a few years, together with my counterpart from Bank of England. And later on, this group was upgraded in 2021 to the G20 Sustainable Finance Working Group, which should become the permanent mechanism within the G20 for coordination of sustainable finance work by many IOs, and for setting up a global agenda such as the G20 Sustainable Finance Roadmap, and for kicking off new ideas, including, for example, a few years ago, the G20 Transition Finance Framework. And many of the G20 work, in fact, spilled over to other international organizations such as NGFS, for example. It was really inspired by the G20 so that they begin to work on the climate risk analysis and to produce tools and all of that.
So we just need to take a second because of the acronyms. It's not you didn't create the acronym soup, but we're both very fluent in them. But so you've got the G20, which is the group of the largest economies in the world. I think most people know that. Then you mentioned ISSB, and that's the International
Sustainability Standards Board, right?
Right. So that's a set of accounting principles to make sure that risk is made transparent in a standardized way. Then there's NGFS. So that's that. And did that come out of the G20 work, out of that working group? That's the network for the greening of the financial system. But actually, it's a group of, isn't it, all of the central banks around the world?
Not all of the central bank. In fact, it was
not all the no.
Yeah, some of the central bank they came together in 2017, including the PBOC, the Bank of England, and quite a few from Europe and so on. And we regard ourselves as a small coalition of the willings, meaning we are showing a lot of willingness to move ahead to forge consensus on green sustainable finance collaboration. And we started in 2017 with only 8 central banks, and now it's more than 100. All the other central banks and regulators there were welcome to join, and now it's over 100 central banks plus other regulators. So that was inspired by the G20 because, as I said, the G20 initially in 2016 already said, let's work on climate risk analysis. Then the NGFS took that sort of inspiration as a major area for its work. Also, ISSP has to do with that G20 because in 2021, I remember the G20 endorsed the launch of ISSP so that the ISSP became a globally recognized standard setting body. Otherwise it would be a regular NGO.
And I have to also ask you, I sold my business to Mike Bloomberg, or to Bloomberg, the company. And, we mentioned Mark Carney, we mentioned your work, ISSB. There's also the TCFD, which was started a bit earlier and I think worked in parallel. Did you work with Mike and Mark Carney on all of this?
Yeah, I work with Mark Carney quite closely because of the G20. In the first 3 years, the G20 Green Finance and later on called Sustainable Finance Study Group was co-chaired by China and the UK, namely by the PBOC and the Bank of England. So Bank of England was chaired by Mark Carney. So we had a very close relationship on that platform. And Mike Bloomberg has worked on a lot of international initiatives, including TCFD, GFANS, and others. My various initiatives are also closely working with them as well.
And for the audience, we'll also put a link into the show notes to my episode with Mark Carney, who came on Cleaning Up a couple of years ago. You mentioned another one of the acronyms, that's GFANS, that's the Global Financial Alliance for Net Zero, which
right.
was pulled together by Mark Carney at COP26, which was in Glasgow in the UK. With all of these acronyms and all of this activity, and there are many, many more, we're also going to talk about a couple more. But one question is, have we reached some kind of has all this green finance peaked? Because, we do see the news stories about State Street and JP Morgan and BlackRock kind of backpedaling coming out of the, what is it? Theirs was the Climate Action 100 Plus, which was the asset owners, asset managers platform that was, very much arose. It was part of GFANZ. It was part of all the excitement in I would say 2021. Everybody got enormously kind of engaged in this. And since then, we're seeing a little bit of backpedaling. Is that your impression? And is that serious? Should we be concerned about it?
No, I think this happens largely in the U.S. As you said, some of the U.S. financial institutions left the CA 100, and I heard some they quit GFANZ and some quit equator principles, but it doesn't affect the global landscape. You can see the sustainable finance volume in terms of fundraising has continuously increased in the last 10 years in a very strong way, and it will continue. I actually had estimated for China, we're going to raise something like 480 trillion RMB in the coming 30 years for green sustainable finance. And globally, there are a lot of numbers, including a number that's cited by G20 saying that we need 4 to 6 trillion US dollar per year for global climate action. So all these are much bigger number than we have today, which means that sustainable finance will have to grow very strongly in the coming years and decades. Now, the U.S. issue, I think, is a little bit more political than technical, because there's some interest group within the U.S. They're trying to politicizing the concept of ESG, and they scared some of these financial institutions when they operate in certain states. That's, I think, the U.S. specific, issue. But globally, as I said, we're pretty confident. Many other economies, especially EU and China, remain very committed to their goal of greening the financial system.
I think that's correct. I share that analysis that it's very much something coming out of the US. Of course, the concern is that they have a presidential election, and those pressures could be, in one version of the future, those pressures could ramp up very considerably in the US. But I guess, on the other hand, neither of us know who's going to win the election. But there are other concerns. I guess, what we also see, and even in Europe, there's a lot of concern about China's dominance of the supply chain in these clean energy sectors, whether it's 90% of the wafers for solar. I've been in Spain, where they have a very strong wind industry. They're very concerned about the Chinese wind turbine manufacturers. Of course, electric vehicles and batteries, these huge market shares in processing the minerals, in producing the batteries. People are terrified about cheap Chinese electric cars flooding the markets. Does that not have implications for the finance sector and for the ability to kind of, integrate, share, allow the flows of capital to work globally?
Now, again, this is a very complex issue. It involves some geopolitics consideration and some, trade-related consideration, and involving protecting local industry, protecting employment, and so on. But generally speaking, I think many countries are adopting some forms of industrial policy to promote their green economic activities. And there are examples like the U.S. Inflation Reduction Act, the EU Green Deal, the Chinese Green Development Program, including our incentives within the system. And in fact, at the global level, like G20, we're talking about encouraging countries to take actions to incentivize the green activities. But your question is more from the trade angle. Some countries are seeing these incentives within a particular country as causing trade frictions, because they may actually endanger their domestic industry, which is competing against the imports. And I'm not trade experts, but I do think we need to resolve these tensions, on the trade aspect versus the need to promote a green economy, green transformation. And at least two things we can consider. One is at a global level, we need some sort of a global level negotiation ideally using the WTO as the platform to define more clearly what are the domestic subsidies, incentives for green economy that should not be subject to trade restrictions and sanctions. So far, it's not clear. Anything can be subject to trade sanctions, even if you are aiming for promoting global climate action. The second thing is that we can promote more bilateral negotiation, for example, between China and Europe. I know some European countries are complaining about China putting export restrictions on some critical materials, and China is complaining about Europe trying to impose higher tariffs on our exports of solar panel, wind turbine, batteries, and so on. But can we actually sit down and talk about a mutually beneficial deal, which is you reduce your trade barriers on us, and we reduce our trade barriers on yours, so that we can create a win-win situation.
So I share your views on trade. I've been on the UK Board of Trade for 3 years. I've just cycled off it, and actually I was very involved in the creation of something that became a WTO negotiation. It was the Environmental Goods Agreement, which nearly got across the line in 2016, and then it sadly fell apart over something really crazy, like the EU didn't want Chinese bicycles or some apparently, but I think it was probably also quite related to maybe geopolitics and to the President Trump's victory in the elections and so on. So I share the view that we need to resolve these trade issues, because that will drive down the costs of the clean energy solutions, and that's absolutely critical. These are very intermingled supply chains, but there is also a security. Yeah, go ahead,
Michael. The other thing I think we can think about is instead of selling everything to Europe, we can think about setting up Chinese joint ventures, and producing electric vehicles and batteries in Europe, which I think will resolve part of the concerns on the European side. And by doing so, the Chinese investors actually can create more jobs in Europe, right?
I think that would be very welcome, but bubbling under it, there is a geopolitical tension, because there's a lot of people saying, well, we're so dependent on the Middle East for oil, on the US for natural gas. Why would we resolve that and become so dependent on China for our technologies right across the industry? I mean, and it is so cool. It's across energy, transportation. So that is, we can't ignore that it's a geopolitical security tension as well.
Yeah, that has to do with this sort of a supply chain resilience argument, which has a lot to do with geopolitical concern. And my argument is that if you overestimate the geopolitical led tension, you will have to resort to these trade restrictions. So it was a calculation of the geopolitical risks. That's a key. And a miscalculation will lead to mistake in decision of trade policies.
Yeah, and I think that will end up with higher costs for the clean energy. Just look, there are lots of lenses where that would be bad, but through the climate lens, it would be bad because it would drive up the costs of the clean energy.
And it will slow down the pace of decarbonization in many countries.
Yeah. So let me come on to this thing, CASI, another of your acronyms. That's the Capacity Building Alliance of Sustainable Investment, which is something that you are, I think you created and you're spending a lot of time working on. Is that correct?
Yeah. The idea actually emerged in the last few years when I was co-chairing the G20 Sustainable Finance Working Group. There are a lot of discussions on developing country, emerging markets facing the problem of lack of capacity. Because green sustainable finance is a very complex area. It requires capacity to design policy, standards, disclosure requirements, and it requires the banks and other financial institutions to develop financial products in the form of green loans, green bonds, green insurance, carbon, market instruments, And also, we need to have the third parties, the verifiers, carbon accounting guys, to provide all these very technical services. So the lack of capacity obviously became the key bottleneck in many countries. I think as many as 100 developing country emerging market economies in launching their green small finance markets. In fact, you can see last 10 years, most of the sizable green finance transactions happening in OECD countries and China. But in the majority of other emerging market economies, they still lagging behind. And that's why it was a growing consensus within the G20 that let's do more on capacity building. And last year, it was written officially in the G20 document that we need to strengthen collective efforts on capacity building. And that's why, to respond to this G20 call, I created this CASI, Capacity Building Alliance of Sustainable Investment. And we launched this network of now 50 organizations by COP, in Dubai, and it's now operational. Our aim is to train 100,000 people in emerging markets, developing countries. We'll be training the regulators like central bank people, the stock exchange regulators, and the security regulators, and so on. Also, financiers, the banks, asset managers, and so on, and also third-party service providers, so that we can help create an ecosystem in many of the countries that need green finance. We are already launching our activities. For example, in Brazil, we're going to host our first face-to-face event for the Latin American countries. And in June, we're going to do this in Hong Kong for the entire Asia. And second half of this year, we'll be launching training events face-to-face for the Middle East and Africa. And on top of that, we'll be doing e-learning. We'll be putting like 100 hours of sustainable finance contents on the web, and eventually create a certificate program so that after you complete 100 hours, you get a certificate of CASI that recognizes your competence.
That's really fascinating. So I had Professor Avinash Persod also on cleaning up. And he's the initiator of the Bridgetown Initiative, talking about this huge cost of capital difference between, let's say, a South Africa and a Germany. So we talk about cheap wind, cheap solar, cheap EVs, cheap batteries. Also in China, everything's very cheap. But of course, if your cost of capital is 15%, it's not cheap. And you're coming at that issue, and the underlying issue is that not nearly enough money is flowing into the global South. And if we don't fix that, we're not fixing climate change. So you've come at this a different way and said it's a capacity issue rather than a sort of, in a sense, a Western or a global financial market cost of capital issue.
Mm-hmm. Well, both are right in some sense. A lot of people are saying we need to mobilize a few $1 trillion per year for developing countries' climate action. And my question is that where do you get this 100,000 people to implement these projects? If you don't have the right people, the money going to these places will be wasted. And you will not see that much money because after one or two failed projects, the money is not going to go there. And really, that's a bottleneck, a key bottleneck for sustainable finance development. And also, we're not just talking about money flowing from north to the south. The majority of green finance money will have come from the domestic economies, from the domestic savings, right? I would estimate that maybe 10% of the global south climate financing should come from other countries, and 90% they should mobilize domestically. For that to happen, they need to have a standard, for example, taxonomy to define green activities. They need to have a disclosure requirements, which is based on ISSB, for example. They should have their own products, the green bond market, green insurance markets, and so on.
Yes, we did some work when I was still with Bloomberg on the attractiveness of different places for investment. And I think one of the absolutely key metrics was whether they have domestic capital formation. Because the idea that it's all going to come from the established financial markets in the G20, it just won't work.
Yeah, take the MDB as an example. Now, despite the very sizable operation of the multinational development banks, they are a drop in the ocean relative to total demand for climate finance, sustainability finance in emerging markets. That's why the MDB can actually use their financing as a catalyst to crowd in a much larger amount of local finance to do projects that meet the climate and sustainability standards.
And just for the acronym watchers, the MDBs, that's the multilateral development banks.
That's right.
Yeah.
Such as the World Bank, ADB, and so on.
And the BRICS Bank, you include that?
Yeah, BRICS Banks it's not called New Development Bank. They have a new name. It's part of this MDB family.
Yeah. A question for you on this focus on capacity building, which I think is absolutely right. I think we've got to work on the cost of capital, but also on the skills and the ability to absorb the money and be productive with it. But did that focus also come out of your work on the Belt and Road? Because you did a lot around greening the Belt and Road, because there was this kind of realization, I think around 2017, that the Belt and Road was financing a lot of stuff, which was essentially putting climate action out of reach.
Yeah, that was another initiative which I and many other friends were creating back in 2018. It was hosted by the China Green Finance Committee, which I chair, and City of London back in 2018. And we said that we need to, green the finance that going to the Belt and Road. Largely, it's the emerging market economies. And we developed 7 principles asking the banks, asset managers, insurance company operating in these countries to assess the environmental climate risk, to disclose their information, and to work with the community on ESG risk and so on. And after 4 or 5 years operation, this network of GIP is called Green Investment Principle for Belt and Road, now expanded to a membership of 48 very large organizations, mostly financial institutions, not only from China, Europe, and UK, but also from many emerging market economies. And we have set up regional chapters of the GIP, which does the capacity building on the ground. So again, the GIP is another platform capacity building, but it's for the members, for the 48 members, which are largely financial institutions. But the CASI is a bigger network of 50 global organizations, and we target essentially everyone who is interested in green sustainable finance from developing country emerging markets.
I just remember a report, which I think you co-authored, which was on greening the Belt and Road, and it was quite stark about the risks if it was not greened, that it would essentially lock us into, I think it was 3 degrees of climate change.
Yeah, I think that was 2018 or 19. My team worked with a couple of other experts, including Simon Zadek. And the conclusion was that OECD countries are going to decarbonize, according to their schedule towards net zero by 2050. But by then, if the developing countries are not decarbonizing, then they will become the majority of the carbon emission in the world. And it basically, highlight the urgency of decarbonizing activities and finance that's going to the emerging market and developing economies.
Right. We're reaching the end of our allotted time. Actually, I've got one other question, which is, you started by referring to a lot of this as green finance, but now with particularly, almost CASI is the end point of a process where it's called sustainable finance. Is there significance to that? Because at least for me, sustainability is economic sustainability, social sustainability. It's not just about the environment, whereas green for me is a more kind of limited factor. Mm-hmm. Is that how you see it?
Yeah, now conceptually, green is a subset of sustainability. Green, in our sort of a domestic context, we refer to financing activity, which is positive for environment, for climate action, for nature, but has not included much of social elements. And sustainability refers to the 17, SDGs, right? Which include not only the environmental, climate, nature, but also, social aspects, including, poverty reduction, education, health, and so on and so forth. So in a sense, sustainable finance is broader than green finance. But in terms of dollar amount, they're pretty similar. within the sustainable finance field, you can see the majority are green finance. And then another concept, a lot of people asking me about climate finance. Climate finance in the Chinese context is 70% of green finance because it's addressing the climate challenge by investing on climate mitigation adaptation. And the rest of green finance is really about the pure environment, like water pollution, air pollution, land contamination, and nature positive activities. So they overlap, but size-wise, I think climate here, green is here, and sustainability is there.
Right, but some of those other areas, and I think there's a fascinating sort of trend, or at least people are still trying to get to volume on things like nature-based solutions and the other aspects of the environment, and try to create financial markets around those. But what we see, we've now got Brazil's initiative around sustainability is definitely putting things like social justice and human rights much more into the core of sustainable finance than climate, nature-based solutions, green energy, or green issues. Is that something that's going to kind of create tension, do you think? I mean, I'm thinking particularly, in the context of the sort of cooling of relations globally around those issues.
I think more and more people and countries are moving towards the concept of sustainability from the narrower climate or green concept. And within sustainability, there will be social considerations. And we certainly need to make sure that a activity that's positive for one SDG is not going to harm the other objectives that much. This is what we call do no harm principles. So a way to integrate different objectives is to apply do no significant harm principle in your project selection, in your assessment, of the impact. And social justice came in back a few years ago in the G20 discussion when we were talking about the transition finance framework. And the reason is that the transition, especially climate transition, in some areas typically lead to sizable job losses. For example, you're talking about coal-fired power generation. Eventually, they will be wiped out, and the people employed in these sectors will have to find new jobs. In fact, yesterday I was hosting the chief economist from EBRD, and they did a survey saying that those people who are laid off from these polluting carbon-intensive sectors, only 16% find jobs in other green sectors, and the majority, 80-something, either lost their jobs or they go to another polluting industries. So that's a social problem which is accompanied by the transition process, and we have to do something, not only rely on government efforts such as social safety net, but also we need to have all the other players, including the corporates and the financiers, to think about how to facilitate a just transition, meaning decarbonizing at the same time, protecting employment as much as possible.
Well, there's certainly a lot of knowledge about how not to do that right in the UK, because we had massive unemployment as we as we restructured our coal industry and some of our polluting heavy industry that was not economic in the 1980s. That recycling of people and skills and communities was not done well. So we're not good at that. Maybe we have some lessons. But I'm just...
There's some experiments, Michael, just to give you one interesting pilot, which is happening in the Chinese city called Huzhou. This is one of the regional green finance pilot cities. They were the first to adopt a transition finance framework in China in the last 2 years. And within that, they're building a just transition element. What they did is they require the company receive transition finance to assess the impact of the company transition on employment. If they say they're going to lay off more than 10% of their staff, then they're required to present a retraining, reskilling program in order to get a transition finance. And the government, after seeing this program, will actually subsidize the loan by giving them a interest subsidy, lowering the funding cost. So this is a positive circle, I think, is created by the framework, because the company suddenly realized that I have both the obligation and actually opportunity to do something on just transition, because it will be encouraged by government, encouraged by the banks.
And I think this issue of job losses is clearly a big part of the justice in the transition. But there's another part which is about traceability in the supply chain. There is concern about right across the board and about working conditions and so on in the supply chains. And that is starting to impact on the ability of finance to flow into companies. Is that traceability? Is that something that, in a sense, do you welcome the idea of that traceability because it's going to sort of raise the standards everywhere? Or is that something that is going to sort of collide with what we were talking about earlier about the need for trade and the need for integration of supply chains? Is that a concern to you, or is it something that you welcome?
In our terminology, we call financing green supply chains. Which means that you find the green supplier, which are typically small, medium enterprises, and give them incentives, for example, cheap money, so that they can further enhance their greenness or ESG performance. One example we had is in Guangzhou. Back a few years ago, I was involved in this green supply chain financing project. We had a special institute which worked on ESG. Now, designing the ESG rating methodology to rate the supplier, small, medium enterprises, to give them scores on ESG, and then give the score to the big company, which is the Guangzhou Auto, because they buy all these raw materials and components. And Guangzhou Auto will pick the good supplier with higher ESG rating. Then the government arranged financing.
It is ESG. It's not just E.
It's not just E. It's actually a fairly complex rating methodology with many, many indicators, and it's weighted and averaged and all of that. But it's an ecosystem. The big company uses the green supplier or ESG, a supplier with better ESG performance. Then the banks will arrange financing, cheaper financing for the supplier. And then the government will provide an interest subsidy to the banks. Through the banks to the supplier. That's how it incentivizes the greening of the entire supply chain.
Yeah, and look, I think you can tell behind my questions the issue that I'm probing for is around the labor conditions and human rights within particularly the solar supply chain, which is a very top of mind issue for a lot of people that needs dealing with, and it needs dealing with, or I think it's going to become a real problem for climate action and in other ways, not just for the progress for its own sake on social conditions, but also as a potential roadblock for working together on these climate issues. It's a very important issue to deal with.
Yeah, of course, in the ESG rating, you can put in a lot of social indicators such as work safety and supply chain, resilience, and so on. So that using this ESG rating methodology to guide the behavior change of the firm.
Yeah. Dr. Ma, it's an enormous pleasure speaking with you. I think we've covered a huge amount of ground, and I thank you. You've been such a central figure. I hope the audience comes away understanding that after your epiphany, your PM 2.5 epiphany in 2013, you've been absolutely central to pretty much everything that has happened in China and also internationally in increasing the flows of finance to the solutions to climate change. It's an absolutely it's a heroic story, and I thank you for it.
Thank you very much, Michael, for giving me the opportunity, and looking forward to collaborating with your podcast.
Well, thank you very much. I look forward to that very much as well. Thank you. So that was Dr. Ma Jun, founder and president of the Institute of Finance and Sustainability in Beijing. And as always, we've put into the show notes links to the episodes and resources mentioned in our conversation. So that's Dr. Ma's 2017 book, The Economics of Air Pollution in China, Achieving Better and Cleaner Growth. The paper by Dr. Ma and Simon Zadek, Decarbonizing the Belt and Road. Episodes 14 and 113 with Jonathan Maxwell, Cheaper, Cleaner, More Reliable, episode 153 with Lauri Miliverta, Shedding Light on Energy's Dirty Secrets, episode 84 with Mark Carney, the $130 trillion man, and episode 145 with Professor Avinash Persod, the Bridgetown Initiator. If you've enjoyed today's episode, please make sure that you like, subscribe, and leave a review. Follow us on Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, or Instagram, and sign up for the Cleaning Up newsletter at cleaninguppod.substack.com. Cleaning Up is brought to you by the Liebreich Foundation, the Gilardini Foundation, and Ecopragma Capital. Thank you for listening, and we'll be back with another episode next week.